Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. Today, I am joined, and I'm very excited, by Dr. Lindsay Cormack, Associate Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Diplomacy Lab at Stevens Institute of Technology. Dr. Cormack's work focuses on political communication, civic engagement, Congress, and democratic participation. She is the author of How to Raise a Citizen and Why It's Up to You to Do It, and Congress and the U.S. Veterans from the GI Bill to the VA Crisis. Her scholarship and commentary have often appeared in major academic journals and outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, 538, and NBC News. Today, we're going to talk about Dolly Madison, one of the most influential and fascinating figures of the early American Republic. So while many people remember her for saving Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington during the War of 1812, Dolly Madison really helped shape the public role of the First Lady and influenced the political culture of a young and deeply divided nation. Lindsay, before I say thank you for joining, I do also want to say for listeners, Lindsay had last year sent me an email. I had published a piece in Real Clear Politics. I'm still relatively new at doing that. And I got a email from, like Lindsay said in the email, the other side of the internet, just thanking me. And Lindsay, I think when we talk about academia and history, you know, people think like, oh, academics, like they're so smart, they're so wonderful, which you are. I just wanted to throw that out there because I think that civic education is such a cool thing. Academia sometimes can be really lonely. And that email was just, again, unsolicited, incredibly amazing. So I am genuinely so honored to have you on our podcast today.
Oh, I'm so glad that it made your day. I mean, anytime I see people doing work that I think is commendable, I know we oftentimes go through doing so many thankless jobs, whether that's like serving on PTAs or board associations or whatever. I'm like, if I can find a point to say thanks, I will.
And it genuinely just like, yeah, made my day. So Dolly Madison, for people who only know Dolly for this like famous portrait story, right? What should they really understand about her broader political and cultural influence on early America?
So I think Dolly Madison can be a touchstone for girls who are kind of, sick or maybe annoyed with always hearing the founders are these men, because I really think all the women who were living at that time were also founders in just as robust a way. So for instance, Dolly Madison is the first person that we call the First Lady, despite the fact that she's not the first wife of a president. But part of that is because she shows us politics is not just stuff that happens in a legislative chamber or in a courtroom or in a president's office. It's all that other softer social things, how we like get ideas to each other, how we talk about patronage, how we link people to people in ways that breaks down sort of like my party says this, my party says that. And so I think she's a model of all the sort of political behavior that truly is a part of the founding of the United States that oftentimes just isn't talked about because she wasn't in an elected position.
So Dolly had no formal political power, yet she became one of the most important public figures in Washington. How did she build that influence and shape politics behind the scenes?
So in some ways, her route to being such like a political nexus is by seeing what our republic needed at the time. So if we go back to that time period, there's this notion that men were good politicians if they were sort of like loners or they couldn't be bought by others or corrupted by sort of friendship. And women didn't have that sort of constraint. Women had to do that social work. And so they're calling on each other, they're coming to each other's houses. And the way that I like to think about Dolly, or something I love about talking about her as a political figure, is women are formally excluded from most political power. But she says, you know what, if we're going to build a civic culture, we're going to have to do something around the symbols that we use, the rituals that we have, the rooms that we're gathering people in. And so her power is not just by seeing she has to do it. Every Wednesday night, she holds a party, like what we would now call like a soiree, but they were called crushes or squeezes. And this is where people from supporters to opponents can all get together, and there's games that they're playing and they're chatting, but it's just a freer way to sort of share information than the confines of like, here's what happens in the legislative halls of power. So I think she does a lot of that stuff, not just about, the institutions of the American founding, but all these other pieces that shore up what we are as a country culturally.
And it's so cool to think about her because what I know from my studies on James Madison is that he was very quiet. He was very reserved, not somebody who today we would call an extrovert, but Dolly really was. How did that kind of, that marriage really help out Madison during his presidency to have a wife who was so extroverted, who loved to kind of be this influence in Washington?
Well, by all the accounts I've read, people credit her for his second electoral victory because after sort of coming to Washington and showing everyone what this power is going to be, he does have struggles politically. And she sort of makes it so that like we can get through these by smoothing or greasing the wheels with political opposition. And I do think what you're pointing out is this balance, this like yin and yang of a good political
Mhm.
partnership. Because even when he goes to call on her when they're starting their courtship, she says like, "Ooh, I'm going to go get to see the great little Madison." And people would say of him that he's like this withered little Johnny Apple, and she's this like beautiful buxom dame. And so they do sort of have these like different features that allow them to move through crowds in ways where she's going to be getting most of the attention, and she feels comfortable with that, and she's fine talking. And he was a quieter, more intellectual man. So there is this like little balance of their personalities that seems to really help us at the beginning.
I love that. So your work focuses on civic culture and political communication. What does Dolly Madison's approach to relationship building and public leadership teach us about democracy today?
Oh, this is a great question. Because the way that we sort of have been taught this lesson is sort of by everyone relearning it on their own instead of pointing to like
Mhm.
the Dolly Madison playbook. But I think what we know about sort of politics is what we can measure is usually like who voted or who put this bill out or who co-sponsored it. But all the other things that we can't see is where a lot of our politics happens. So that's like having vacations together, doing baseball games
Mhm.
together, having people over for dinner. And that sort of softer versions of power or less seen versions of power are no less real. They're just harder to measure. And so we learn them when you're interacting on a PTA or if you're going to a city council meeting, you realize like, ooh, there's all these sets of relationships that happen behind the scenes that really can affect outcomes. They make people nicer
Mhm.
to each other sometimes. They allow people to have shorthand to say like, ooh, I trust this person in one place. I don't know a lot about this other issue. I should probably trust them on that too. So it's all this sort of relationship building stuff that really does change our formal politics in ways that are harder to see, harder to measure, but no less real.
So why do you think Dolly Madison then still resonates in American memory more than really any other early political figure, including some who actually held office?
Well, I'm glad that you think she does. I don't actually think she gets her due. If I had my druthers, there'd be like an HBO series that was, all of the Dolly Madison powers. That's what I would work for. But I think, we can point to her in the way that she allows power to be used that's both brilliant, but also within the confines of her time. So it's not as if she said, like, I want to be in power. She said, okay, here's the structures of my day. Here's where I can push on the margins. Here's where I can sort of consolidate power. And so I kind of consider her one of like a lower F founder, one of these like people who's still, sure, she doesn't sign the documents. Yes, she doesn't draft them, but she did help make the country feel real and legitimate and durable and enduring. And so that might be why people remember her more today. She also was showy. She grows up as a Puritan, and it takes her about 25 years. It's the second marriage that she has to James Madison before some of her friends come and say, like, probably gonna have to get rid of these frocks if we want to get a little bit more of attention. And she does, and she changes the way she dresses, and she wears these, big turbans, and it's sort of like people are like, does she think she's the queen of America? And the answer is no, but she does realize that we're going to have some sort of like regal look if we're going to command some sort of attention or respect. And I think she weaves it in a very nice American way.
So she is, like you said, the first lady. Even though we have Martha Washington, Dolly is the first one named that. How did what she did during her husband's presidency affect the kind of office of the first lady? Because we know there's no there's no guidebook in the Constitution about what the first lady is supposed to do. So how did she kind of help shape that for future first ladies?
Well, it's something that you said. It's not laid down that says here's what
Hmm.
everyone has to do, but she does have this role of hostess, and she does sort of make it her own thing to say, I'm going to have these parties because this wasn't James Madison's crush or squeeze. This is sort of Dolly
Hmm.
Madison's gathering of people. And so by sort of asserting a role, I think she gives us this like story about what civic courage sort of looks like, which is like, yes, I don't have someone who said I can or can't do this, but I can carry out something that makes us better in a way that no one has necessarily has to give me approval for. And I think that's like pretty courageous of her time, but it also is within the bounds. She's not like offensive to the sensibilities. And so
Hmm.
it works. It's like pushing the edge, but not too much.
And I love then to think about the first lady as more of this civic role because oftentimes when we think about civics and we think about participation, we think about voting and holding office, but there are so many ways to be a citizen and to involve yourself in civics. And Dolly seems to me to be a really great example of how that can work. And I'm sure that there are people that are like, well, she just threw parties. That's not that big of a deal, but it really is. And so it feels to me like Dolly helped define what civic engagement could look like in a broader sense.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think that that's something that we need to continue to tell younger people, people of all
Mhm.
ages, is it's not just voting. It's not just running for office. For instance, Dolly Madison, she's a convener. If you bring people in the same room, you make conversation possible. Convening is civic power. She's also a bridge builder where she sort of says like, okay, there's people with different views. Let's invite them all. Maybe they can have a relationship after getting to know each other in a social function. Yes, she is a memory keeper where she sort of has this institutional knowledge of people who are coming and then not coming and what they're saying and who they're talking to and who needs patronage positions. She's also
Mhm.
sort of like a civic educator in that world where she's like allowing this information flow that's outside of the prescripted sort of like halls of power. But that's like in some ways institutional caretaking. It's sort of like this, like, you have to like care for things when they're not just in work. You have to care for them when they're out of work. And that's sort of how I see this happening for her. But she's also like a public witness to the time to say, like, here's what's happening. Here's the people who are voting for this. All these sorts of things are like what we think of as organizing today. And oftentimes that's like not given the same count as like, well, you're not getting a candidate elected or well, you're not going to vote. But all that stuff is civic care. It's not just on election day. It's all these other times that we have to do these things. And hosting is certainly a way to build a civic space.
I love that term civic care. Well, and coming from Arizona, I always think about Justice O'Connor when she was in our state legislature. Yes, she was in an elected office, but she understood that gathering people, in her home and feeding them and having those conversations over a meal was something that was incredibly important because it's hard to look at somebody over Mexican food and not see them as a person. And so I love the term civic care. Like I've never heard that until today. But what a powerful thing to do. So I
Well,
guess when the,
I'll give you an example of
yes.
civic care. I'll give you something that I think about. So in New York City over the last few years, we've had like a number of contentious elections. And
Hmm.
something that I have started to do is this post-election potluck because I run in civic circles, I run in political circles. A lot of us, either have a candidate who wins, or most of us have candidates who lose if there's, if you're just playing the whole spectrum of politics. And so the day after the election, which is a Wednesday always here, I'll host a
Hmm.
potluck where I say, like, you won, you lost, whatever, bring a dish and let's share because we all have to like go into this next phase of this is the new person who's going to be the mayor
Hmm.
or the city council person or whatever. And I think that those are forms of civic care where it's like we show that this game doesn't end on like, oh, election is over. It's like, okay. And now all of us who are outside of the formal halls of power still have to inhabit this space. Why don't we talk about how we're going to do that? And it's not, I want you to vote for my candidate. That's over.
Hmm.
That's done. We're just continuing.
Well, and I love that it is very much we're all on the same team here. Like, as opposed to, I think sometimes, especially with younger people, because they're the social media that they consume, it tends to divide of like one or the other. Like, my candidate won, my candidate didn't. But in this civic care, what you're talking about is, yes, that happens. And let's reconvene because we're still a community, we're still neighbors. This is something we're all doing together, whether your team, quote unquote, wins or loses. Are there any more stories or lessons from Dolly Madison that you think our listeners need to hear?
I think there's probably plenty. I think one that's sort of interesting is how, when we think about sort of like transgressive forms of power, there's a time when Henry Clay is he's in the legislature and he doesn't like James Madison and he's like going to come after James Madison for this like discussion on what they're going to do in sort of like a foreign policy piece. And she realizes that like this is not an ally of my husband, but she invites him to the house and they share snuff out of her snuff box, which is sort of like a transgressive thing. But when I talk about this with people in New York City, when I give like public lectures on it, I'm like, and we all know a good way to make friends is sharing drugs. Like if you look at like dance scene culture, rave scene culture, it's like you might not be friends, but if you're willing to do this sort of like transgressive things together, okay, then you're willing to be a weird sort of bridge builder or a necessary
Mhm.
sort of bridge builder. And she has all these other little things that are not just like, I dressed up and I had parties. It's like, and I saw that there were little inserts that I could do my little like political work in. And I think there's plenty to learn about her. And there's people who have written about her, and she's worth more of our study.
I love that. Lindsay, thank you so much. I have like, again, I love doing these podcasts because I get all of these ideas and all of these, thoughts for like extra research. And I think that my summer is going to be spent on first ladies because
That's an
there's
excellent
so
way to
much
be.
there's so, in this America 250, I do not want to discredit what our founders did, but now I want to understand, I think, a little bit more of the civic care, the civic engagement that went in from women who were not in office during that time. So thank you so much for being on our podcast and for chatting with me about Dolly Madison, kind of the first influencer.
Totally. I mean, we can all fight for who first influencer is, but thank you so much for having me because I think the more people who care about this, the better.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.